to the Eisenhower Presidential Library's Evening at Ease program for the month of June. I'm Dawn Hammett. I'm the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, and I am coming to you from beautiful Abilene, Kansas. I'd like to thank you for being here and spending some time with us. We have a very special presentation tonight. We have Emily Miller. Emily has a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Maryland School of Law and a master's degree in international studies from the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, and a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of California, San Diego. I don't know what I was doing there, Emily. I'm sorry, Erin. She's a licensed attorney in Maryland, where she lives with her 2 Shiba Inus, and frankly, since it's been Take Your Pet to Work Day for about 3 months, we're hoping they make an appearance. She's going to be talking to us tonight about a book that she's recently released called Final Flight, Final Fight, My Grandmother, the Wasp, in Arlington National Cemetery. She's the proud granddaughter of Elaine Harmon, a member of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs, during World War II. Her grandmother's last request was to be laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. After she passed away in April 2015, this request was denied by the United States Army, which runs the cemetery. Erin led a successful grassroots social media and direct lobbying campaign to fight this decision. Erin will now tell us this amazing story. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, good evening, and thank you to the Eisenhower Library for having me tonight, and thank you to all the people who are joining us virtually, and I'm so happy that you're here. And I know there's some people from Women in Aviation and the National Aeronautic Association and my mother, so welcome to everybody. We'll get started. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, and also my grandmother, my relationship with her and her service with the WASP, and also our family's campaign with Congress to make sure that her legacy and the legacy of the WASP was honored at Arlington National Cemetery. So it's kind of a multi-layered story here. I'm not telling strictly a history story. It's kind of a lot of things going on. So thank you, and next slide. So this is the logo, the mascot of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, Fifinella. So you might see this logo on different things associated with the WASP. My grandmother was very insistent that they are the WASP, not the WASPs. That's an argument for, I think, grammar people, but I say the WASP because that's what my grandmother taught me. And that stands for the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Fifinella is one of the little gremlins for one of the stories by Roald Dahl. And she is a little female gremlin, and it was actually designed by Walt Disney and licensed to the Army, to the Women Air Force Service Pilots, so they could use it as their mascot. And so I always like to incorporate that. Kids like to see that one a lot too. So next slide. Also, I have a lot of slides, and most of them are just pictures, so don't worry that there's lots of slides. It's for your entertainment. So the history of the Women Air Force Service Pilots, what did they do? The Women Air Force Service Pilots were the first group of female military aviators for the United States Armed Forces. They flew in a civilian capacity for the United States Army during World War II. And I will get into a little more detail of why they were civilians versus being part of the Army as we go along. But this is one of the more well-known pictures of the WASP coming off the tarmac there with their parachutes. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the WASP came together out of 2 groups of folks. One was started by Nancy Love, and then another group was started by Jackie Cochran. And I know the Eisenhower Library has a Jackie Cochran collection, right? So that's relevant here. So the Women's Flying Training Detachment was a group started to train women to fly military aircraft. In addition to that, Nancy Love had started a group as well of civilian women to fly ferrying missions. So, you know, Rosie the Riveter from World War II worked in the factories, right, riveting, building planes, and the planes would come off of the line. The ferrying squadron women would go get these planes and fly them to the appropriate location so they could be moved to where the military needed them, overseas, mostly, right? So these two groups were started and eventually merged together to form the Women Air Force Service Pilots in August of 1943. There were more than 25,000 women who applied to this program, and 1,830 were accepted. There were 1,074 graduates, and then in addition to some of the ferrying squadron women, there were a total of 1,102 women who served as Women Air Force Service pilots. After they graduated training and were doing some of these missions around the United States. Next slide. This is one of their pictures. They eventually moved to Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. They initially had started out in Houston, but for various reasons, including the weather not being very helpful for flying, it's foggy down there, and other reasons, they eventually moved to Sweetwater, Texas to Avenger Field, and that was an all-female training field. So they were all women together training there to learn to fly airplanes. Next slide. So this is Jackie Cochran reviewing some of the Women Air Force Service pilots, and I believe that is Hap Arnold with her, who was kind of the general in the Army who helped arrange all of this to happen, even though it still was not officially done as part of Army policy. It was still civilian working with the Army. Next slide. So what did the WASP do? They flew domestically. A lot of people think that they flew overseas and did other types of missions, but that is not the case. They flew within the United States doing domestic missions. And the purpose of the group initially was to allow more men to be freed up to go overseas to fly combat missions. I'm sure many of you are aware that during World War II, the air missions overseas were quite dangerous, and there was a lot of fatalities. So we needed to replace pilots and air crew and that thing over and over again. So Nancy Love and Jackie had these ideas that, okay, well, why don't we take some of the women in this country who have pilots licenses and use them to do some of the missions within the United States, allowing more men to go overseas. And it seemed to be a good idea. So there were women who had licenses like my grandmother. So they went down there and they flew domestically. They flew military cargo around the United States. They transported new planes. Like I mentioned, the Rosie the Riveter would build the plane. They would pick it up and fly it somewhere. They were test pilots for new planes. And they towed targets behind planes for new ground gunner Army recruits to shoot at, to practice before they went overseas shooting down airplanes. They would tow banners behind them, like you've ever seen at like the beach or the lake. They have the advertising behind the airplane with those big banners. They flew a banner kind of like that, and the men on the ground would practice shooting at them, which sounds like kind of the most dangerous job, but ironically, of the women who died in training accidents or during otherwise during WASP service was just other sorts of accidents, not because they got shot down. So that sounds like the most dangerous one, but actually wasn't the most dangerous one. Next slide. So here's a picture of one of the WASP. You can see the banner behind the airplane there, and one of the WASP looking up at it. Next slide. So if you miss the pictures, you want to look at them longer, like they said, they're recording it, so don't worry if you don't see it that long. You can go back and check it out later. Here are a couple more of the WASP flying the B-26, Elizabeth Gardner and Ruth Helm, who later lived in Arizona, whose name will come up later on in my presentation. The WASP learned to fly every plane that was in the fleet at the time, from little trainers all the way up to the B-29 bomber. So not every WASP obviously learned to fly every plane, but there were a few WASP or certain amounts that learned to fly each type of airplane. Okay, next slide. Excuse me. This is Hazel Ying Lee. She's one of the 38 women who was in the WASP who died during WASP service. I believe she was the last one to perish in late 1944. She was also one of 2 Chinese American WASP, which was unusual to have. You know, a lot of people, especially younger people, ask me about diversity in the WASP, and so I bring her up a lot. Next slide. So now we bring in my grandmother and how she became involved with the Women Air Force Service Pilots. My grandmother was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1919, December 1919. She went to college at the University of Maryland, College Park, and she learned to fly at College Park Airport, which is right next to the University of Maryland. College Park Airport is the oldest continuously operating airport in the United States, and her uniform and gold medal are on display at their museum there. She entered the WASP program in March of 1944. After she graduated, she was transferred to Nellis Air Base in Las Vegas, which is still an operating Air Force base, Nellis Air Force Base, which probably many of you have heard of. It's pretty well known. My grandmother was a pretty independent kid, liked to do her sports. In college, she was on a bunch of different teams and activities. She was a cheerleader. She was on the rifle team, swimming, sorority, all kinds of things. And then her last year of college, she saw an advertisement for a program called the Civilian Pilot Training Program, which had been started by the United States government to increase the amount of people in the United States with pilot's licenses. So she became part of that program. They only let 1 woman in for every 10 men, and the fee was $40. And my grandmother had a fairly conservative, traditional mother, and she didn't think that her mom would approve of her flying airplanes. So she asked her dad to sign a permission slip, because if you were under 21 and a girl and not married, you had to get permission from your parents. So he signed the permission slip and gave her $40 so she could sign up for flying lessons. So out of $40, you got, I think, 35 hours of ground school and flying time. So, I mean, pretty good deal if you think about how much flying costs these days. So next slide. Here is a copy of my grandmother's flying pilot's license, which is in the College Park Aviation Museum. Next slide. And here's a picture of my grandmother in her uniform. She was in class 44-9. So there were various classes. They were kind of designated by the year 44. She was started in April 1944, and the graduating year is 1944. And then 9 is the 9th class of that year. And she was the second to last class to finish the program before it got canceled. Next slide. And here's my grandmother, I believe during training on a plane, one of her favorite airplanes, and she enjoyed that one. Next slide. So what sort of contributions did the WASP make to the war effort? They flew more than 60 million miles. They tested airplanes, towed targets, as I mentioned earlier. They trained other pilots. My grandmother's mission after she finished training when she was at Nellis Air Base was to train men on instrument training in a BT-13 airplane, which meant the BT-13 is the type of plane you sit one behind the other. So she would sit in the front seat, a man would sit in the back seat. They cover up the cockpit and they have to fly only looking at instruments without looking outside the cockpit. So they have this like dark material that covers the cockpit. My grandmother used to describe to me her job was to make sure the men didn't crash into Mount Charleston. That was her job. They delivered more than 12,000 new or repaired aircraft. They freed up pilots to go overseas during war. And again, they were the first women to fly military planes for the United States Armed Forces. Next slide. So the program was disbanded in December of 1944 because in the summer of 1944, a bill to make the Women Air Force Service pilots formally part of the Army failed in the United States Congress by 19 votes. So they were never formally inducted into the Army. And I'm sure if you're watching this, you're very aware of World War II history. At that point, the war was kind of turning towards Asia, turning towards more of a land war, and there was a little bit less emphasis on the European air war. So there was less of a concern about needing all these pilots, on top of many other factors, which you can read in some other detail. But there were a lot of people against making the women formally part of the Army because they were pilots, and it was considered very much a man's job. So the program was eventually canceled in December of 1944, and my grandmother and the other women went home and went about their lives. My grandmother, prior to moving back, she moved back to Maryland for a short period, and then my grandfather was overseas, so she was waiting for him to come home. She actually ended up working as an air traffic controller in Oakland, California for a while, but eventually came back home to Maryland and raised 4 kids. She was already married before she entered the program. So she went home to Maryland and went about her life. Some of the women tried to stay in the aviation community, and some of them were successful at that, but it was a lot of work for them to stay involved in that very male-dominated community. And there are some good stories from those women who worked hard to stay in that in the aviation world. Next slide. So as I mentioned, women were not formally inducted into the Army during the war, and a lot of them went home, like my grandma, and went about their lives and didn't return to aviation. Some did, some stayed in it. There were a lot of different paths that they took. But in the 1970s, the service academies were integrating women, the Naval Academy, Air Force Academy, etc. And they started also accepting women into pilot training for the Air Force, which had been formed in 1947 after the end of World War II. And so many of the newspapers and articles were talking about, oh, this new group of women, and they're going to be the first military pilots. And my grandmother and her friends thought, hey, well, we did that like 30 years ago. Maybe we should go, make sure everyone knows about it. Part of their downfall and part of their charm is that most of these women, like my grandmother, are quite humble about what they did. It was their job. They were serving their country. But for that same reason, I think they spent 30 years, 35 years where nobody knew that they had done any of this. And to their detriment, it required them to go back to Congress and demand recognition many years later. So they went to Congress, and over the course of several sessions of Congress, they had bills introduced to try to recognize them retroactively as veterans. And eventually in 1977, with the GI reauthorization bill, became Public Law 95-202, which was assisted by Senator Barry Goldwater, who had worked with the WASP during World War II, as well as signed into law by Jimmy Carter. And this bill allowed the WASP and other groups who had served during World War II to apply to the Department of Defense to request retroactive veterans recognition. And that was granted to the Women Air Force Service pilots by the Department of Defense in 1979, which is when my grandmother received her DD-214, 35 years after she left service. So some of you may or may not know, the DD-214 is the document people receive when they separate from active service in the armed forces in the United States, showing how long you served and what you did, etc. Next slide. So this kind of just summarizes what I was just explaining. Yeah, next slide. Sorry, it's a little awkward because I can't see all the slides and I'm trying to figure out what I say. All right, so this is, I add this in for my legal friends here. This is Section 401 of Public Law 95-202, which is the paragraph requiring the Department of Defense to take a look at groups who feel they have served in a capacity meeting the requirements of the armed forces but had not been recognized. Next slide. And here's my grandmother's DD-214. And part of the reason I bring up her DD-214 as well is that it comes into play later on. The red arrow is pointing at the sentence that said the service is considered under all laws administered by the Veterans Administration, which is the precursor to today's Department of Veterans Affairs. So that comes into play later on, so you put a pin in that. So next slide. So around this time period is when I come into the picture. Right here I am. And I did have a t-shirt when I was very small that said Gammy flew planes in World War II. So I like to say I've been advocating for my grandmother since I was a small child. Next slide. So after the fight in the 1970s, my grandmother and many of the WASP spent much time going around the country and actually to other countries, giving talks and lectures, just like I'm doing right now, at libraries and museums and schools, especially schools, about their service and what they did in the war. And because my grandmother lived out here in Maryland, very close to Washington, D.C., she was often invited to many of the big government functions and to the White House for breakfast and things like that on Memorial Day, Veterans Day, different events involving veterans or Air Force folks. So to me, it was very normal for my grandma to put on her uniform and be like, I'm going to breakfast at the White House. Like that was normal to me. So just, you know, keep in mind that's what I was growing up with. But she didn't make a big deal out of it. She was very nonchalant about all of this. Next slide. So this is my grandmother with one of her other WASP friends, Elaine Rogers, and then the other picture is the three of them with Toby Felker, my grandmother, and Elaine Rogers, just at some of their events. Next slide. So in 2002 came up the first instance that was related to something that came up later with my family and how I got involved in all of this. In 2002, Irene England, who was also one of the Women Air Force Service pilots, passed away. Her daughter wanted to lay her to rest at Arlington Cemetery, but Arlington said that she was not eligible to receive a military funeral. And so her daughter led a campaign to fight against that, and eventually the Army relented and put out a press release, a statement saying that the WASP were eligible to be laid to rest in the columbarium, which is like the mausoleum where you can have the cremated ashes, and that's the part in Arlington Cemetery where they have that. That's what it's called. So there were already Women Air Force Service pilots at Arlington. People sometimes think my grandma was the first one, and that's not the case. It's just that the law over the year was very confusing and kept getting interpreted differently. Next slide. So here's Toby Felker's gravestone at Arlington. Next slide. So over the years, the WASP have become more well known for various, because they were out lecturing and because they were out going to activities and because other people were helping them become more well known and giving talks about them. So on this picture, on the right-hand side there, you see Nicole Malachowski, who was actually the first woman to serve as a Thunderbird pilot, the Air Force's demonstration team. And she became involved in this fight when she was serving as a White House fellow, and she wrote S614, which is a Senate bill to award the Congressional Gold Medal to the Women Air Force Service pilots. And that was kind of one of her projects while she was serving in the White House. And that bill was signed into law by President Obama. And my grandma is right there behind his right shoulder. And B. Haydu is on his far right. And then Elaine Rogers, who I mentioned earlier, is on the left side of the president. And that is the day that the bill got signed into law. My grandmother was invited to the Oval Office to be present at the signing of that bill. Like I said, she got invited because she lived nearby, and so it was pretty cool. I think she enjoyed it. She was a little sad she didn't get to meet the dog of the White House that day, though. So next slide. And this is at the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony about next spring. So they actually had a huge ceremony at Capitol Hill in the U.S. Capitol. A lot of senators and members of the House of Representatives were there to actually physically present the gold medal. And then there were various replica medals that were passed out to the Women Air Force Service pilots. My grandmother's medal is in the College Park Aviation Museum, along with the certificate that goes along with it. And this is Senator Mikulski, our senator from Maryland at the time. Next slide. So I show this slide for a reason. My grandmother really enjoyed going to Applebee's because on Veterans Day, they give free meals to veterans. And I went with her on occasion on Veterans Day. And they never questioned her veteran status at the Applebee's. And I bring this up because as I go along, you will see why it becomes ironic. Next slide. So like I mentioned, my grandmother went around to different air shows and museums giving talks. And this is, I believe, at Oshkosh up there in the big picture. And then the smaller picture, I think, is at Reading Air Show in Pennsylvania. So some of you may have been to these events. So my grandmother used to attend some of these to represent the Women Air Force Service pilots. Next slide. This is just a fun picture of my grandma. She used to get rides in planes all the time from different people who own them at different air shows and around the country. And it was she enjoyed it very much, being offered all these rides in the planes. Next slide. This is a picture of my grandmother in the B-29 Fifi, which is now one of 2 B-29s which are operational. There, I believe, is still only one woman who is qualified to fly it at this point in time. And this B-29 appears at different air shows around the country. And I have a picture of myself sitting right there, and I tried to like replicate the picture. So just another good picture of my grandma. Next picture, next slide. Like I mentioned, from the time around the 1970s until my grandmother was no longer physically able to, which spanned roughly 50 years, my grandmother would go give talks and lectures about the WASP. And it was important to her to make sure that the next generation, and actually anybody who didn't know about them, but especially young people, learned about the Women Air Force Service pilots and their role during World War II and the importance they played in the development of passing forward for women in the armed forces and generally in society. Not because she thought she was so great or wanted to talk about herself. You know, she felt like it was important because they learned after the 1940s that a lot of people had forgotten about them because they didn't talk about themselves. Next slide. So my grandmother passed away April 21st, 2015. She wanted to be laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. And as I mentioned, there were already WASP there. My grandmother had attended funerals for some of her WASP friends at Arlington Cemetery. So my family did not think this would be an issue. My mother sent in the paperwork or called Arlington and told them, you know, she had passed away and was filling out the paperwork and, you know, very routine. And they said, okay, and the end. But again, here comes this little blurb from her DD 214 that says her period of service shall be considered active military service for the purpose of all laws administered by the Veterans Administration. So if any of you are aware, Arlington National Cemetery is run by the Department of the Army, which is separate from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Next slide. So unfortunately, the cemetery called back about a month later, I think, and told my mother that the Women Air Force Service pilots were not allowed to be laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery on their own merit. So, as I mentioned, my grandfather had a physical issue. He was not allowed to be in the armed forces, so he was serving in a civilian capacity overseas in Asia and during the war. So my grandmother was seeking to enter Arlington Cemetery on her own merit with her service as one of the Women Air Force Service pilots of World War II. And the cemetery called and said no because of that language that I just explained to you. Basically, they told her she was a veteran in one part of the federal government, but not the rest of the federal government. So, of course, my family, being descendants of this kind of feisty woman, decided we can't really just leave it at that, right? We have to figure out if there's a way to get around it. And we learned that there is an exception to policy, but we didn't think she should be admitted as an exception, right? Like she deserves to be there, and that's what we believed. So around Veterans Day of that year, so roughly 7 months after she passed away, I started posting on social media. This is my grandmother's cremated ashes and her wings, or some of her wings. Her real wings are different, but she had several sets of replica wings. And I posted about this, and a lot of people got very angry when they learned that Arlington was denying access to my grandmother. Next slide. So we launched a campaign where I decided that we should have various facets here. So I decided if we have a PR campaign and make a big deal in the media, then the Army will look bad and they'll change their mind, right? But as we were moving along, I realized we needed to actually get a law passed, because if the Army changed their mind and changed the rule, then a year later they could just change it back. And if we got a law passed through Congress, hopefully it would prevent them from changing the rules so ambivalently in the future. So we launched a media campaign. I did a lot of interviews with reporters around the local area in Washington, D.C., and eventually that got the attention of some bigger outlets like the Associated Press, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And during this time, we also had a petition on change.org, which also got a lot of attention. It was really easy to share on social media. So part of the reason I do these talks is to also explain to, especially young people that talk about activism and they want to make change, like how do you do it? How does a law actually get changed? So this is part of my story. So I was doing all these media interviews, we had a petition, and all of this attention made its way to the United States Congress, which is what we needed in the first place. Next slide. So here's a screenshot of our petition. Next slide. And some of this is from the New York Times. So next slide. Throughout this process, we gathered support from all kinds of people around the world, actually. And a lot of the people were from groups like Women in Aviation International and some of our veterans groups and other aviation groups that told their members, you need to call your member of Congress and make sure that this bill gets passed and support it and sign the petition. And it was very helpful because obviously as one person, as a family, it's hard to reach out to millions of people, right? We need supporters who have already an organized network. So that was really helpful to us. So I always try to say thank you to them. Next slide. This is some more of our groups. Next slide. So while this was getting all this media attention, a member of Congress and her staff found our story, and it was actually a very good coincidence. Her name is Martha McSally, and she was sworn into Congress in January of 2015, about 3 months before my grandmother passed away. Martha is a retired colonel from the United States Air Force and served 26 years in the United States Air Force, and she graduated from the United States Air Force Academy. And while she was serving in the Middle East, she became the first woman to fly a combat mission for the United States military. And it was kind of a really good coincidence that she happened to be in Congress and she had such a connection to aviation. And while she had gone through her Air Force career, she had met some of the Women Air Force service pilots. So it was a very good person for us to have there to help fight for us. And remember, when she was overseas, it was roughly 50 years after my grandmother had been flying planes that she became the first woman to fly a combat mission. So it took 50 years for that to happen. Next slide. So here's Martha with some of the other Women Air Force service pilots like Don Seymour, and I can't remember everybody's name there, I apologize. Next slide. Again, here's Martha. She previously was in the House of Representatives when she was helping us from Arizona's District 2. Next slide. So the bill that she introduced was numbered HR 4336. And the purpose was to amend Title 38. So the bill I talked about earlier from 1977, this bill was going to amend it to require the Army to recognize the service of the Women Air Force service pilots for eligibility at Arlington National Cemetery. Next slide. So she also did a bunch of media and talked about this and talked about her bill, which was, again, very helpful because you want to bring as much attention as possible and get everyone on board to support you. Next slide. So there's my mother on the right, and I know she's listening in. My sister Whitney, my niece Isabella, we went down on the day that Martha introduced this bill. This is in her office on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And we went down to meet her and say thank you for supporting us. Next slide. And this is from a special session on the floor of the House of Representatives where she talked about the bill and was trying to get her colleagues to support this. And, you know, it's on C-SPAN. I got very excited about C-SPAN. That was a new thing for me, getting excited about C-SPAN. And next slide. So we also had a Senate companion bill introduced in the United States Senate, and that was S-2437, led by Senator Ernst from Iowa and Senator Mikulski, our Maryland senator. Senator Ernst is also a veteran. She was in the National Guard and served active duty overseas as well. Next slide. So now I have some pictures. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, walking around to different offices in person, talking to the members of the House and the Senate and their staff, making sure that they knew about the bill and that they would support it and vote for it when it came up for a vote. I visited more than 150 offices in person on the Hill to talk about this bill and make sure that everyone knew about it. I think legislation in Congress, you kind of have to keep their attention on it, and that's why you have to constantly be like, you know, can you vote yes, and keep the media attention so that it keeps moving forward. Next slide. So here's some of our other supportive members. Kathleen Rice from New York, who actually has done a lot of stuff with the WASP too. There's a big aviation museum in her district. Representative Rose Leighton from Florida, who's retired now, but she was in Congress for a long time, and she actually was the sponsor of the Congressional Gold Medal bill, which you saw the picture earlier of President Obama signing it. She was the member that was in that picture. Next slide. So Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota also was very supportive and did quite a few media stories. And there's a WASP from Minnesota named Betty Strophus, who did actually a media story with Senator Klobuchar during this whole time. Unfortunately, Betty passed away in the midst of all of this before the bill was signed into law, which was very sad, but I'm glad that she saw we were, you know, fighting for her. Next slide. So we did a press conference at the United States Capitol in March, about a week before the bill was going up for vote, and you can see all the senators and members of the House there, and my mother. So all kind of trying to get media attention, make sure people know about the bill, and keep people calling in and saying that they, you know, support this. Next slide. So fortunately, the bill passed unanimously on March 22nd, 2016. And I was very grateful that I was able to attend that in person and watch the vote in person. And then it went over to the Senate and passed there eventually in May. They changed 2 words in the bill, so when it changes, you have to go back to the other chamber. So it went back to the House, got passed there again. And then it was signed into law by the President of the United States on May 20th, 2016. Next slide. So here's just, this is a picture from the day it passed the House with Martha, and then just some of the news. I wrote an op-ed about the bill. Next slide. And what better way to celebrate getting a law passed than getting the law tattooed on your arm? So there you go. I have the law tattooed on my arm, or the bill, I should say, the bill. Next slide. So here's the actual law after it gets signed into law. It becomes Public Law 114-158. And that actually is a flag from my grandma's funeral and some of the bullets from the 21-gun salute. Next slide. So back again to my discussion about the bills and the laws and what happens when the bill actually becomes a law. So it changed Title 38, Section 2410. So the section highlighted in yellow is what happened. This didn't exist, and then the bill passed, and now this is in the law, and it says that the Women Air Force Service pilots are eligible to be laid to rest at Arlington Cemetery. Next slide. So September 7th, 2016, after my mother had called the cemetery again after this bill passed into law, the cemetery approved our request to have my grandmother laid to rest there, and the funeral was in September 2016, so roughly 17 months, almost a year and a half after she passed away and getting a law passed through Congress, we were able to have a funeral for her at Arlington National Cemetery. And in contrast to what she requested, you know, no big deal, small thing with the family, it was definitely not that. It was a very big deal. There were hundreds of people there. We had dozens of people from the New York Times, the Washington Post, all kinds of media outlet there. members of Congress. I mean, it was really, really nice, all the people that came to support us and make sure that the story was complete. Next slide. Here's a picture of the honor guard, which I will point out was female. We had a female honor guard, a female chaplain, so, you know, very female heavy, which was nice. Honor for my grandma, I think. Handing the flag to my mother. Next slide. And here's us walking over to the columbarium at Arlington. And he's carrying my grandmother's urn, which was donated by John Sword from Idaho, who has a handcrafts various wood urns. It was very beautiful. Next slide. And some more pictures of the Martha and the 3 WASP that were able to attend. Marty Weil, Schutze, Reynolds, and Shirley Cruz. And then my brother-in-law, Matthew, there. Next slide. And this was a very big honor. Some of the members of the Warbird community volunteered to fly their World War II airplanes as a flyover at my grandmother's funeral. So we had three P-51s and 3 T-6s. One of the P-51 pilots had an issue, so 2 P-51s in the end, but it was very much a big honor to have these people volunteer their time, and it's expensive to do this, and really, we were very honored that they came down to Arlington to do this. Next slide. And here's one of the pilots, Scott. He flies the plane on the right there with the stripes. That is Quicksilver. And then we have the T-6 down there on the left, and Rob on the right there, who's one of the T-6 pilots. Next slide. And this is a really cool picture. They took this picture, as you can see the Pentagon down here. This picture is as the planes were flying over the Pentagon to come into the funeral to do the flyover. So this is one of the coolest pictures. Next picture, next slide, sorry. And then we had a memorial service at the Women in Military Service for America Memorial next door to Arlington, which you should visit if you go to Arlington. It's Martha and I and the 3 WASP who were able to attend the funeral. And if you can see my grandma's here, right? This is from the funeral, from the memorial service. Next slide. So we had a very nice funeral, a memorial service, and we had some great speakers, and I really wanted to honor the moment, not just my grandmother passing away, but a celebration that we had gotten this honor done for all the Women Air Force Service pilots, and we were very honored at all the people who attended and wanted to honor the WASP, rightfully so. Next slide. Some of the WASP that were not able to attend, I had them email me some quotes, and so we read them at the funeral. And I think this is a nice one from my grandmother's friend. Next slide. So since that time, I've kind of taken on some of what my grandmother used to do when I travel around the country and do presentations at libraries and air shows and schools and virtual presentations and talk about the Women Air Force Service pilots and their history and about our campaign. And I kind of try to connect and explain why it's important to remember history and honor people who have done things, because many years later, if we don't recall what they've done, you don't want to forget and honor their appropriate place in history. Next slide. So down in Texas, each year at the Women Air Force Service Pilots National Museum in Sweetwater, Texas, they had been having each year at Memorial Day a reunion of sorts where some of the WASP would come. So I had been going the last few years. Unfortunately, this year, because of the pandemic, it was canceled. But if you're ever in Sweetwater, Texas, there's a WASP museum there that you can go visit. Next slide. So I just like to thank everybody for supporting the WASP and the story and trying to help me and my family and all the other Women Air Force Service pilots and their families remember what these women did and honor it appropriately. Next slide. So after all of that, my grandmother was laid to rest at Arlington, and this is her headstone. So if you're ever in Arlington Cemetery, you can go visit her gravestone, her grave in the columbarium. And I thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions, we're going to do a question and answer session now.
Wow, Erin, what an amazing story. Thank you so much. We actually already have a few questions queued up in the chat section. So while everybody's sort of thinking and preparing, oh, you're showing your book. I'm sorry, Erin, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's fine. Yeah, so I have a book too that kind of goes into more detail of what I just told you, but if you're interested, you can buy it online at various outlets, wherever you prefer. Okay.
We were supposed to have it at the library, but you know, things went awry.
Things went awry. Well, I can send you a copy.
We'll get some.
Okay.
So we have a question from Scott. Scott writes, wasn't Mrs. Gardner the WASP featured on, was it Life magazine?
That was her name is escaping me at the moment. Slade. Shirley Slade, that was her name.
Okay. Then we have another
cover, yeah.
We have another question from Levon K. Levon writes, you mentioned 2 Chinese WASP. Who was the other one, and why were Black female pilots denied entrance to the program?
The other Chinese American WASP was Maggie G, who happened to be my grandmother's best friend from the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Maggie was from Berkeley, California, and coincidentally, my sister is currently running a campaign to try to get the Oakland Airport named after Maggie G, because she's from that area. Why were Black women pilots denied? So, as you're also all aware, during this time period, we had a lot of other issues going on, and supposedly when women who were African American were applying to the program, the leadership of the program felt like it was already difficult enough to deal with trying to get women into the Army, that if they tried to get women of color into the program as well, it was going to create too much, even more difficulty. So unfortunately, at least one that I know of, and possibly more, were denied this. But many of them went on to fly elsewhere. So as you know, we had the Tuskegee Airmen, who were created as a separate, segregated group of African American pilots during World War II. So there was a lot of issues surrounding all of these things.
Dan writes, how many different planes did Gammy fly? I would love to hear make and model.
Oh boy. Okay, so my grandmother's logbook is actually at the College Park Aviation Museum. So if you're ever in the area, you can go check it out. So she flew the basic trainers, so Stearmans, your PT-17, PT-19, AT-6s. These were the basic planes they flew in training. And then, as I mentioned, when she was done with training, she was transferred to Nellis Air Base, and that is where she trained men in a BT-13 airplane. So she probably, I would say, flew that one the most hours, I would guess, since that was the main job she did. And she also was a co-pilot on the B-17 bomber. But as she told me, she was like, I didn't exactly know what I was doing on that plane, so I hope that the person who was actually flying it didn't, pass out or something. And I'm like, I'm sure you would have been fine. But like I mentioned, all the WASP learned different airplanes. So some of them were trained to fly pursuit aircraft. Some were trained to fly the big bombers. It's just, so if you go out and want to find more information about individual women who flew certain airplanes, that definitely is out there.
All right. Janet writes, please clarify if interments as well as inerments are included in the law. Okay,
so Arlington in particular has very strict rules about the service a person has rendered and what entitlement they receive because of that. So the highest honors at Arlington for full military funerals, which include a caisson, which is the horse that draws the carriage with the casket on it, and they have the 21-gun salute and the whole, the band and everything, is usually for people who have retired or are, has served 20 years in the service. And then there's different levels below that. So the minimum level there is that you have served 1 day of active service, and that entitles you to at least be laid to rest in the columbarium, which means you have to be cremated, and then you are entitled to have a military funeral, but there's no caisson there for if you're not an officer, etc. This is where it brings in a second issue that we didn't really litigate, which was since they were retroactively recognized as veterans and they were pilots, they probably should have been commissioned as lieutenants, which meant they were officers, which meant she would have been entitled to a higher level of funeral. However, just the fact that we were arguing about them getting recognized at all was a big enough issue. So we didn't really go into even further detail as to like what theoretical rank she would have had. So that's another issue that people can research and learn more about.
All right. Scott writes, what was the hardest part of getting the law passed? Did you have difficult people who were hesitant to lend support?
I think the most difficult part of getting the law passed was initially getting attention and trying to figure out how to get everyone on board at first. And I think a little bit it's like a train. Once people start coming on board, it just gathers momentum, which is why I was talking about you have to constantly be doing media interviews and talking to people and making sure people remember that this is happening, right? Because while all this was happening, the election of 2016 was happening and world events were happening. There was a terrorist bombing in Brussels. There was, all this other stuff is happening, right? And so you need to make sure you focus, at least continue to focus some of the attention on what you're trying to accomplish, even though all this other stuff is happening. So those are, I think, the two main things to keep in mind that were the hardest.
Okay. Lavon's curious, how many WASP are still living?
I think there are about 28 or so. So I don't know. Yeah, there were 1,102 total, right? We have about 28 left.
All right. Brian asked, what was the tipping point in gaining support to change the law?
Honestly, I think once we had Martha McSally come on and lend her support to that, it really changed the trajectory, because before it was just us talking to the media and getting attention for the story. But once Martha came on board, her bill had, I think, 79 co-sponsors when it was introduced, which is, almost a quarter of the House of Representatives. So that's a big deal to come out with a bill with all those people on board. So that was important. And then, we had all this media support and all these organizations, like I mentioned, with lots of members were already signing the petition and calling their, members of Congress. And so I think just that initial support from Congress really pushed it over the edge.
You have a handful of comments about the bathroom at Avenger Field with regard to allowing or not allowing African Americans to participate. Would you like to expound on these comments?
I don't know how the bathroom gets involved if there were not African American women participating at all. I'm not sure how that comes into play.
Well, perhaps in a moment we can open it up to a conversation on the bathrooms.
Okay.
Linda writes, talk about the note Maggie Gee had so people wouldn't think she was Japanese.
So this actually is something very interesting. So like I mentioned, Maggie Gee was my grandma's best friend. They had a very interesting dynamic between them. My grandma was like more conservative and traditional, and Maggie was much more liberal. She was from Berkeley, so they're very funny friendship they had. But Maggie Gee grew up in a very traditional Chinese family and neighborhood. And during World War II, as again, I'm sure you're aware, our government took Japanese descendant folks and put them in camps and removed them from, in particular, the coast areas. Maggie was Chinese, not Japanese. So she walked around California with a note on her that said, I'm Chinese, I'm not Japanese. And when she went to Texas to start training with the Women Air Force Service pilots, she said, something really interesting to her was meeting all these women pilots from different backgrounds from across the country. You had women from the cities, women from farms, like all different backgrounds, and especially for her, a lot of Caucasian women that she had never, hadn't really interacted with too much since she came from a very tight-knit Chinese community. So it was interesting to hear that from her.
And Kayleen asks, are WASP displays from the College Park Museum online?
I do not think so, but they should be. I have pictures of some of this stuff on my website, but you should perhaps write to the College Park Aviation Museum and request it, and perhaps the county will pay for that to happen.
So that's the end of the questions that were in the chat box. If anybody else has a question, perhaps you can unmute yourself and ask Erin before we move on.
Erin, this is Linda.
Hi.
And I read your book in 2 days. I couldn't put it down. Your grandmother was really feisty. And do you have any of her traits?
I think I do have some of her traits, mostly good ones, I hope. I am very independent, which she also was. I like sports a lot. She was pretty athletic, and I'm pretty athletic. You know, I like running and playing sports, and she was into that. I'm sure my mother is online. She could probably give you some more things. Sometimes it's hard to see things in yourself that other people don't see. But I will say at the funeral, at the memorial service, my sister Tiffany made a really nice speech where she talked about how my grandmother, a characteristic from my grandmother had been present in each of her grandchildren, and it was really a cute thing.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I encourage everyone to read the book. It's a very easy read, and I love how you wove the personal story with the history.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Anybody else want to ask a question? Are we going to end it right at 8 o'clock? Well, before we thank Erin for being here with us, I'd like to tell you about some of our upcoming programs. This Thursday, June 11th at 2 p.m. Central Time, we have our second D-Day program, which will be in partnership with the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And on this program, D-Day Plus, How, we will discuss how we sustained the troops after the invasion took place. So the URL it'll be on this platform, and the URL will be posted on our Facebook page and our website. Our next Lunch and Learn program is scheduled for Thursday, June 25th, and we will host Elise Evans from the Eisenhower National Historic Park. She will talk to us about the Eisenhower's life at the farm. So tonight's program is sponsored by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Union Pacific Foundation. And we are very, very thankful for the support that we get from both of those entities. So whenever you're out and about in Abilene and you see the Eisenhower Foundation people, make sure you tell them I said thank you. We have our book talk in July, which will be the Alice Network, which is a fabulous book. So I hope y'all read that and join us for that as well. So if you would please take a moment to help me thank Erin, and I hope to see you at our next program. Thank you, Erin. What an amazing program.
Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm glad you tuned in.